Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode on contemporary Western philosophy. Last time we saw the early life and education of Jean-Paul Sartre, and we saw how this led to his philosophical thought development process. Today we'll go a little bit further on and we'll take a look at his introduction to his ontology. Now, when we look at the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, we see that it is based on a unique way of understanding reality as well as existence. His ideas help explain why he believed life is often absurd and why human beings struggle with freedom and with meaning. And to understand Sartre, we need to explore his ontology, which is the study of being. Now, here are some key concepts in Sartrean ontology. First and foremost, we see that Sartre explains reality using three important ideas. Now, the first one among them is the being in itself, that is the être-en-soi. Now, this refers to things that simply exist without awareness. Next, you have the being for itself, that is the pour-soi. This refers to things like humans that are conscious and self-aware. And last, he speaks about nothingness, that is the gap between what we are now and what we could become, allowing freedom and choice. So, with our freedom and with our choices, what we could become in life. Now, let's take a look at each of these with simple examples. So, when we speak about the being in itself, être-en-soi, this basically refers to things that exist but they are not aware of themselves. These things are simply without questioning their existence. So, for example, in the being for itself, we could include things like rocks or a table, because we see that a rock or a table, it simply exists. It does not think about itself, it just is. A tree, for an example, grows and changes, but it does not ask, why am I here? Therefore, every person can be treated as être-en-soi when they are just seen as an object. For example, when a worker is just being treated as a pair of hands rather than a thinking individual. Now, let's come to being for itself, that is the pour-soi. Now, when we speak about the pour-soi, it refers to things, as we said, that are aware of their own existence. And these are the things that can think, they can question, and they can make choices. For example, each one of us as humans are pour-soi because we can think about ourselves as well as our future. A dog, on the other hand, does not worry about what it will become in life. But we as humans, we worry about what the future will hold. For example, if you look in the mirror and think, I need to improve myself, you are showing self-awareness. You are not just existing, but you are thinking. In a way, we can say you are thinking about your existence. And the main important point here is that the pour-soi is active, changing, and it is questioning. And humans are pour-soi because they are not just existing, but they are also thinking about their purpose, choices, as well as their future. And next, we have the nothingness. That is what we could say or call as the space for freedom. Now, this is the gap, as we said, between what we are now and what we could become. It is what allows us to change, make choices, and be free. For example, imagine a student fails an exam. Right now, they may think that they are a failure in a particular subject, but there is nothing stopping them from studying harder and becoming a top student. For example, a person who hates their job is not permanently stuck. They can always quit, they can learn new skills and change the future. Similarly, a poor person is not doomed to stay poor forever. There is a possibility to change their life through effort. And therefore, the idea of nothingness is central to Sartre's concept of freedom. Since humans have the ability to imagine different possibilities, they are never fully defined by their past or present. They can always change. However, we see that this freedom is very scary because it means we are responsible for what we become. And this leads to Sartre's famous idea that man is condemned to be free. Now, why does this matter? Okay, why does Sartre's ontology matter? Now we see that Sartre's philosophy helps us to understand why humans feel a sense of uncertainty. Okay, and we see that this uncertainty can be very scary. We have already seen this during the pandemic situation. It also implies that we feel a sense of responsibility and also sometimes despair about life. Now, unlike objects that simply exist, we humans are becoming something. And because of our freedom and our choice, we are never fully defined. So we cannot permanently put ourselves in one category, but we are responsible for creating meaning in our own lives. And therefore, this idea of self-awareness, choice, and absurdity of existence forms the core of Sartre's existentialism. Now, let's take a look at being in itself, être-en-soi. So, as we said earlier, être-en-soi basically refers to the things that exist, but they do not think, question, or make choices. Now, when we look at reality, we see that Sartre would divide reality into two types. That is, being in itself, être-en-soi, which we are looking here. And so these are the things that are just there without any awareness or freedom. Now, what does being in itself include? Well, being in itself includes non-living objects. For example, like rocks, you have trees, tables, and buildings. Anything that exists in a fixed state without possibility of changing itself. Even human beings, when treated as objects, when treated as slaves without having any kind of choices in life, when they are treated as slaves, we see that they also come under this category of the être-en-soi. And the key idea here is that things do not question or make choices, they simply exist. So, for example, when we look at a rock or table, a rock does not think about itself, or it does not decide to move. It is simply there. A table does not choose what to become. It remains a table unless an external force changes it. Now we may ask the question, what about a robot? Well, when we look at a robot without artificial intelligence, it only moves in one direction when you push a button. Why? Because it does not think or make decisions. It just follows a set of patterns. Now we see that people also can be treated like objects. Okay, so even human beings can be treated as être-en-soi, that is, being in itself, if we see them only as objects and not as people with dignity. For example, a worker in a factory who is treated only as a machine to do repetitive tasks without considering their thoughts or emotions, they would come in this category of être-en-soi. Similarly, a person who is in a relationship being seen only for their looks but not for their personality or feelings, they also would come in the category of être-en-soi. Now, in both these cases, we see that the person is reduced to an object without freedom or individuality. And therefore, what are the characteristics of being in itself? First and foremost, it is fixed and unchanging. It does not grow or it does not change on its own. It lacks awareness. It does not think about its existence. There is no freedom or spontaneity, so it cannot make choices in life. And above all, it is passive. It does nothing by itself unless acted by an external force. Now, let's take a look at, now, before we move to being for itself, we need to understand that Sartre here will contrast being in itself with being for itself. So, être-en-soi is contrasted with pour-soi. Why? Because being in itself helps us to explain why Sartre sees humans as fundamentally different from objects. In short, we see that being in itself is like a stone that just is, whereas being for itself is like a human who asks, what should I become? Now, when we come to this topic of being for itself, that is the pour-soi, Sartre would say that pour-soi refers to beings that are aware of themselves and they have the ability to make choices. Unlike being in itself, which is fixed and unchanging, being for itself is always changing, it is always becoming something new. And therefore, being for itself will include, in a way, humans. Why? Because we always, in a way, think and we are self-aware and we make decisions. We are also conscious. We have the ability to think, to question, and also imagine new possibilities. And we see that this whole thing is a process rather than being in a fixed state. It is not just being, but it is becoming. For example, we see that a student who is choosing their career path, a student may not know what they want to do in life. They are not fixed like a rock or like a table. They must choose their path. They might either become a doctor or an artist or a teacher. There is no predetermined future. Similarly, when we look at an artist starts with a blank canvas. They can create anything. They can make a landscape or a portrait or even something abstract. Now, a painting does not exist until they make it happen. Just like humans create their own identity through actions. Let's consider a person who is moving to a new country for a fresh start. There is somebody maybe who feels unhappy with their life and they may decide to move to another country. And they may want to start their life all over again. So unlike a tree, unlike a stone, unlike a table which is rooted in one place, a human has the freedom to change their surroundings and they can redefine themselves. Now, what are some of the characteristics of being for itself? First and foremost is self-awareness. That means they can think and reflect on themselves. Next is freedom. It has no fixed nature. They must create their own identity. They are always becoming. It is never complete, but it is constantly changing. And ultimately, we see that it is not predetermined. There are no inborn rules or purposes limiting what it can become. Now, why this is important? Because Sartre believed that humans are free, but they are also responsible for their choices. Since we are not born with a set purpose, we must decide what we want to become. And therefore, this freedom can be overwhelming, which is why Sartre will talk about anguish. That is the feeling of responsibility that comes with total freedom. In other words, we see that being in itself is like a rock that exists. Being for itself is like a human person who must decide what they want to do in life. And therefore, we see that we as humans must decide what we want to become. And as we are in this process of becoming, we will feel anguish. This feeling of responsibility is something that accompanies freedom. So we have this concept of freedom with responsibility. Now let's take a look at nothingness, the role of absence in Sartre's philosophy. So for Sartre, we see that for Sartre, nothingness is not just a simple absence or void, but it is an active part of human consciousness. Our ability to think, question, and make choices in a way depends on our ability to separate what is from what is not. Now, what is nothingness? So, nothingness is something that allows us to think about possibilities rather than just accept what exists. It is created by human consciousness. So, when we imagine, question, or deny something, and it plays a key role in freedom and decision making. Now, nothingness does not exist on its own, but it only exists because we can think about it. So, for example, let's say you go to a cafe to meet a friend, but they don't show up. Now, their absence, in a way, is strongly felt in life. Why? Because your mind creates a kind of a gap, a feeling of missing something. And this is exactly what is Sartre's idea of nothingness, when we notice what is not there and that shapes our experience. Let's take, for example, another person who is looking for a job. He might say, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an engineer, but I could be something else. This not being creates possibilities. It pushes them to imagine a new future and make choices. Now, their freedom comes not from recognizing what they are not and deciding what they want to be. How does nothingness shape our lives? Well, it helps us to, in a way, by allowing us to imagine different possibilities that are there in life. If we could only accept what exists, we could never change or improve our lives. It also, in a way, gives meaning to our choices. At the same time, we feel responsible for our actions because we see what might have been. And therefore, we can regret, we can look at the missed opportunities in our lives. Now, at the same time, we see that this will also create anxiety and also freedom. So, since we are not fixed beings, we must constantly define ourselves through our choices. And ultimately, we see that it is important for us to understand these concepts. And so, therefore, nothingness is important in Sartre's philosophy because it is what makes freedom possible. Because we are aware of what is not, we are not trapped by what is. We can imagine, change, and take control of our own existence. However, this also creates responsibility since we define ourselves through our choices, and therefore we cannot escape the burden of deciding who we are. In simple words, we can say that nothingness is like this empty room that we have over here. And it helps define what is there. Now, without nothingness, we could have no freedom to change or create meaning. So, for example, in this second picture, everything is set as it is. So, there is no much move to or no much room to change things. Why? Because these are there. Here, you can start from scratch. You can arrange the way you want it. And therefore, here we see that Jean-Paul Sartre's famous phrase, existence precedes essence. It means that we are not born with a fixed purpose or meaning, but we define ourselves through our choices and actions. And in this way, we see that this becomes a very important part in his philosophy. Now, when we look at the traditional view will say that it is essence that precedes existence. And therefore, many philosophies and religions would believe that things have a predetermined essence or purpose. For example, a knife is made with essence or purpose of cutting. Similarly, a clock is the one that is made with the essence of telling time. In some religious views, we also see that humans are in a way believed to have a fixed nature or divine purpose before they are born. But Sartre will say that it is the existence that precedes essence. We are not born with a set purpose. We first exist and then we create our own meaning through our actions. As a result, there is no pre-written destiny. So therefore, when we look at this, we can compare it to a blank canvas. We have the freedom to make choices in our lives to define who we want to be. And therefore, this implies that we, in a way, are responsible for who we become. Since we are not born with a set nature, we must take responsibility for our actions and choices. Life has no given meaning. We create our own. If we feel life is meaningless, then it is, in a way, up to us to create our own meaning through what we do. And freedom is both exciting as well as scary. Why? Because it means that there is no excuse for failure. We cannot blame anything on destiny or fate. So this is all for this small introduction to Sartre's philosophy. Next time we'll take a look at his philosophy of the world.